Go ahead.
Okay, great. It's 12:01, so I can say good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Diana Elliott. I'm calling in from the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, Cowichan Tribes Nation. I'm living on the Quamachin village in my home office today. And so I welcome everyone. There's 12 of us so far on the call on the Zoom. So welcome to you all. I acknowledge you. I acknowledge this time together. I acknowledge this topic. I don't know how many of you today have actually participated in learning and understanding the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and where it came from and why it came. So thank you for being here today for this topic. Thank you for the invitation to be here. So today I will just start off with a blessing from my heart to yours. Blessing and giving thanks to our Creator for this time together. Thanking the Creator for the work that you all do, that we all do together, the work that we do for children, Indigenous children and families, but all children and families in BC. And I just give thanks again to our Creator for the teachings that we already carry of our ancestors, of our elders, and of our knowledge keepers. And those are rich resources. So if you're ever able to work with any of our elders or knowledge keepers to help you on this journey through truth and reconciliation, I give thanks in advance for that. So thank you all for being here, and let's have a really good presentation and discussion. Haichka.
Thank you, Elder Diana, for guiding us with your words as we start today. I would like to begin by noting that I'm meeting virtually here today on the Coast Salish lands, the unceded territory of the Katzie, Kwantlen, and Symbia First Nation. It's on this land we live, we learn, and do our work. We at FSI are grateful for the opportunity to live, learn, and share on these lands, and we honor the resilience and ongoing contribution of the Indigenous people across Canada. Before we dive in, just a few quick housekeeping items. The teaching portion of today's session will be recorded, but the Q&A and personal sharing will not. This way, everyone can feel comfortable participating openly. The recording, along with any resources shared today, will be made available in my follow-up email, along with a list of supports that you can access if you're feeling triggered or upset from the material being shared today. Please keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking to minimize background noise. You're welcome to turn on your camera if you feel comfortable. It helps us create a sense of connection. There will be opportunity for reflection and questions, so please use the chat or raise your hands if you would like to join the discussion. Our today's first session on reflection, responsibility, and reconciliation is part of our ongoing commitment to learning and unlearning together. This is a space where we can deepen our understanding of Canada's history, the legacy of residential schools, and the path towards truth and reconciliation. We're fortunate to be joined today by our speaker, Symbia Barnaby. It's now my pleasure to introduce her. Symbia is an Indigenous woman of Haida and Mi'kmaq belonging and descent. She's a mother of 6, a practical nurse, and a traditional helper. She's also a storyteller, filmmaker, community researcher, and a fierce advocate for inclusion and healing. Symbia joined FSI earlier this year as our interim Indigenous practice advisor, and we are so grateful for the wisdom and teaching she brings to this work. I'll now pass it to Symbia, who will begin with her own land acknowledgement and guide us into today's session. Symbia?
Oh, Julianne. What an amazing introduction for our time together today. I want to share a little bit about where I'm from and some teachings, and then we'll go into the rest of our work today. So my English name is Symbia Barnaby. I'm okay for people to refer to me as Symbia. My traditional feasted Haida name is Gugajung. My spirit name or my ceremonial name is Warrior Woman. These are all names that were gifted to me and that I hold with roles and responsibilities to many different nations. I currently reside on the traditional unceded territory of the Coast-Tsimshian people, specifically the 9 tribes of Lachlan and Metlakatla, which is colonially referred to as the city of Prince Rupert, in what is known or referred to today as the Northwest Coast. So I've lived amongst the Tsimshian people and have roles and responsibilities to them. I've lived here for pretty much my whole life and have elders that I sit with that are Tsimshian, that are Haida, and that are Mi'kmaq that I hold responsibility and who I answer to. Yeah, so I also want to share that the work that we do through FSI, it touches the unceded traditional territory of many different spaces. So as a provincial organization, FSI acknowledges that our work spans across all the traditional, ancestral, and unceded Indigenous territories in BC. Therefore, we respectfully honor all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, as well as their ancestors who have lived here and cared for these lands. It's with great gratitude that we get to live, learn, and do our work in the province, which is now known as British Columbia. I also want to share some of our commitments before we go into the learning opportunity today. So the first one is FSI's commitment to truth and reconciliation. If we're okay, Julianne, to share that slide. So FSI's commitment to truth and reconciliation. We're guided by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which establishes the individual and collective rights of Indigenous people and protects them from discriminatory practices and policies. We call for an end to the systemic inequities faced by Indigenous people and their communities. As a provincial organization that supports individuals and families with disabilities, we recognize and acknowledge that interactions of race and disability bring with them multiple marginalizations. We commit to creating equitable spaces for Indigenous people, Indigenous staff, partners, and community members, and will raise our voices in effort to elevate issues and strive for positive change. Next slide, please. Yep. I also want to share FSI's commitment to anti-racism today, which is also an important part and goes hand in hand with our commitment for truth and reconciliation. So as BC's only peer support organization for individuals and families with disabilities, the Family Support Institute of British Columbia is available to anyone in the province of all backgrounds in every region and every city. Built on the principles of mentorship, inclusion, belonging, support, knowledge sharing, equal rights, and equitable opportunities combined with the foundation of respect, encouragement, working together, and speaking out, we are guided by teamwork and collaboration. Next slide, please, and thank you. So I want to ask a question. Why are we doing this learning? Why are we here together? Why is it important for us to start looking at and reviewing the work that we're going to be doing for the next 3 days together? So first of all, it's important to have knowledge about our shared Canadian history. If we don't have that knowledge, we can inadvertently speak to or make reference to, and we don't know that we're causing harm because we're not understanding, we don't have an idea of those things that have occurred between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people throughout history in Canada. So it's really important for us to have an idea of that. And many of us, I would say, may have not even had that exposure when we're in high school or going through our schooling, or it may be not even until college or university that we had an understanding, a little bit of an understanding about what events have started to happen that led up to residential schools, their implementation, and then their legacy. So it's really important for us to have that knowledge about our shared Canadian history. To fully understand our commitments, we need to know what events caused the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report to be written in the first place. So in order for us to understand FSI's commitment to truth and reconciliation and the recommendations that we're going to apply to the work that we're doing, we need to understand how did it come to be in the first place, right? Why it's also important is because every Canadian holds the responsibility to fulfill the 94 calls to action from the TRC report. If they can't fulfill it themselves, they have a roles and responsibilities to hold either their provincial government or their municipal government, their provincial government, and the federal government to those calls to action. They're also to look at their workplaces, their places of faith, their places of connection, and ask, how are we upholding these 94 calls to action? Because they're already laid out for us, for those that are in Canadian society to be able to read and be able to action off if they work in the section or sectors that are named within the report. Lastly, this learning space will give us time to discuss these events as a group and ask questions. So it's a safe space, a brave space. When I share that it's a brave space, it means that we're focusing on the learning part of it. There's no blame, shame, or anything like that. All the questions are important to come forward so that we'll be able to have those discussions. Because I'm sure if you're wondering about this or you're unsure about this, your neighbor is also worried or unsure about it. So we'll have time for questions and answers at the end, like Julianne said. And so if you have a pen and paper, if you want to write them jot them down in the chat. We'll do our best to address those at the end. Next slide, please. Okay, perfect. So as I was doing these slides, I was thinking, oh, these are all the important things to share a little bit about residential schools so we have an idea. And then I thought to myself, I think we need to go further back than that. So one thing that's really important, 2 points that I didn't list in the slide here. One was about the Royal Proclamation. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that or if you've done any kind of research around it, but it was really important to point out because this is kind of the beginnings of, before or what led to the implementation of residential schools in the first place. So the Royal Proclamation was in 1763, and it was issued by King George III of Great Britain on October 7th, 1763. I already said that. So what's important about this is that it was an agreement that was, or it was a statement that was made to say, okay, the people that are coming together in what later would be referred to as Canada, they were starting to look at, oh my goodness, people are trying to come from what we now know as the United States. They were trying to come up north in, fur trades and wanting to come and to do that like exploration of the West kind of thing. So they wanted, the people that are what we refer to now as Canada had wanted to stop that expansion, that northern expansion from those that would now be considered people from the United States. So they went and said to King George, hey, we need a way to stop them from coming up and expanding. So they went and put it forward and said, we want to be the only ones that can do treaties with Indigenous people. Because they figured if they were able to do that and that it was recognized, then it would stop that further expansion. So the proclamation, at least temporarily, forbade all new settlements west of the line drawn along the Appalachian Mountains, which was delineated as an Indian reserve. So this set a line and said, hey, you're not to come in to start trying to do treaties with anyone above this specific line. The proclamation continues to be of legal importance now for First Nations in Canada, being the first legal recognition of Aboriginal title, rights, and freedoms. So in it, it stated basically that as Indigenous people, because of they were trying to list famine, wars, death, sickness. Oh, the Indigenous people, they're weak or they're feeble or they need to be cared for, because look at all these things that are happening, right? And then from that, they put it forward as, oh, we need to make sure that we're going to take care of these Indigenous people. We're going to be the ones that does the treaties alongside them. We will be the ones that help to look out for them. We will be the ones to look out for the land. And through that, it made it so that nobody else can make those agreements. But it inadvertently infantilized Indigenous people, right? On paper, it looked as though they were not capable to care for themselves. We need to be the ones that can do this to care for them, and painted a picture of Indigenous people as, without constitution, without the ability to care for or provide for, and things like that. So it's just really important that that was kind of the seed that was planted, and that they went and found legislation by saying, hey, they were here. We want to take care of them. We want to make sure that this land doesn't get negotiated by anybody else. Then the Constitution came along, and it was written within it the same thing. Absolutely, Laurie. So I want to share the next piece right there. So about residential schools. So they said that there was residential schools or industrial schools that existed prior to this, but the one that they recognized the most as the so-called first residential school is the one called the Mohawk Institute. And it was built and then opened in 1831. I remember about 5 years ago maybe 10 years ago, reading the next line and being just shocked, right? That the last residential school closed in 1986, and that school was called the Gordon Residential School. And for everybody that's in the chat and everybody that gets to watch in the future, understand that all of us were alive in 1996. I always ask people, can you do the math? How old were you in 1996, right? I would have been, so I was born in 83, 1996, I would have been, was that 13, right? So I would have been somebody that would have gone to school up until that age. And to me, that's pretty scary. I luckily was, I came to BC, and they didn't have any open. I wasn't mandated to go into to residential school. So residential schools were mandated also as per the Indian Act in 1920. So if you think the implementation of the Indian Act came in, and they had many different things that were listed in it, but one of the amendments that were made was in 1920. They said any child of a certain age where they needed to go into residential school. And they could make it, which made it illegal for parents to not surrender their children to go to residential school, or if they hid their children and then that people found out, they could go to court, or they could be in trouble for not sending their children to school. If Another important point to point out was that over that time period, there was over 130 church-run schools that were residential schools. The three main churches that were in charge of helping out to run these residential schools were mainly Catholic, Anglican, and then United. Presbyterian was there for a bit, and then it melted into the United Church. That as they were opening up, like I said, the three main ones that were running them. This was government sponsored, which is really important to understand when you're looking at a contribution and roles and responsibilities. It was the church, and fueled by or sponsored by the Canadian, what we consider the Canadian government now. And the main goal of residential schools was both to educate and assimilate Indigenous youth. Oftentimes there's two different quotes from Sir John A. Macdonald, and he basically said, as fast as readily as we can see fit, we want to see their assimilation. And others, I forget the gentleman's name, but I know he was around Vancouver Island, but he had said, basically, we're trying to take the Indian out of the child, right? If you think about that, it's not just assimilation, that's genocide. So over that period of time, there was approximately 150,000 children and youth that attended residential schools. On average, the age was between 4 and 16 years of age, but there was also some records of babes being born to some of the youth that were there, so that there was babes there, and some as young as 2 years old, right? There at the time when the report came out, there was a recorded around 3,500 deaths that had occurred in and around or as a cause from being in attendance at the residential schools. And now, with the recovery of child remains at old residential school sites, that number is closer to 10,000. And we've seen over the last how many years, within the last 5 years, that we've watched more and more communities start to put funding towards being able to do ground penetrating radar and doing location recovery of child remains or markers to show that there was grave sites at the schools. It's really important to understand too that residential schools, that they had half days, that part of it was centered on teaching skills, and then the other part was actually for them to work on fields, work on things to be sold by the residential school. So there's lots of different things that happened as a result of places that they wanted them to either learn or help to subsidize the schools. So really, it was free labor or exploitation of the children in order to have goods that could be sold to help subsidize their attendance at the school. There's many other things to point out around residential schools about the abuse, about the loss of language, loss of culture, loss of spirituality, loss of family connection, loss of teachings when it comes to how to raise a family, how to be in community, song, dance, ceremony, all of those. Those are all forms of loss that every single Indigenous person who is alive right now in what we consider Canada has experienced some form of loss due to residential school. And when you look at the different forms of abuse that happened at residential school, it wasn't only just physical and sexual. There's mental, emotional, and spiritual abuse. A lot of people don't always think about that spiritual abuse part of it, right? If you were forced to learn a religion that does not belong to you, and anything that you did prior to deemed as unholy or incorrect, it is forcing and putting upon a people a form of spirituality or religion that doesn't belong to us. So that is spiritual abuse as well. Next slide. Okay. So I wanted to share something that really stuck out to me when I was doing my research around this that I didn't name in this. But Phil Fontaine, I'm not sure how many of you know who he is, but he's a really important Indigenous figure. So Phil Fontaine was elected Manitoba Regional Chief for the Assembly of First Nations in the 1980s. And he was elected Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs in 1991. But in 1990, he first spoke publicly about the physical and sexual abuse that he experienced at the Fort Alexander Indian Residential School. And it's really important to point that out because a lot of people were not talking about this publicly before this, right? So it was so important for people to know who he is, because he's like a whistleblower, right? To say, hey, this is my experience there. And he brought that truth part to the forefront to actually speak of his experience, which led to, many of the other things that we're going to talk about right now. So the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People in 1991, it's really important to know because they came together and they released a final report in 1996. And it was a Canadian government commission to investigate and propose solutions for the evolving relationships between Indigenous people and the government and society. So its landmark 5-volume, 4,000-page report called for significant changes to recognize Indigenous people as self-governing nations within a unique place in Canada. Key findings and recommendations included a call for a new relationship founded on mutual respect and self-government, increased resources for community development, and a comprehensive agenda for renewal over 2 decades. Just got another note here. Where is it? So the purpose of this commission was primarily their mandate was to investigate the evolution of the relationship between Indigenous people and the Canadian government and society as a whole, and to propose practical solutions to persistent issues. So this is, as you know, the church and the government are getting called out for being responsible for hurt and loss and abuse at residential schools, right? So to understand a little bit, you need to know the background. So the commission was established in response to growing unrest and important events such as the Oka crisis that highlighted the fundamental issues in the relationship between Indigenous people and the rest of Canada. So the report, the final report, like I said, had 5 volumes and had over 400 recommendations. The vision of this report was of a renewed relationship based on the recognition of Indigenous people as self-governing nations within Canada, which I mentioned already. The areas of focus, restructuring the relationship, so establishing a new nation-to-nation relationship between Indigenous people and the Canadian government, self-governance, fostering Indigenous self-government and strengthening Aboriginal nations and institutions, community development, focusing on healing, economic development and human resources, and development to support self-reliance, and then land and resources. So recommending a redistribution of land and increased resources to support Indigenous communities. The reason why it's really important to understand what that Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples was is timeline, right? So 1991, they're talking about how do we start to fix some of the things, the relationships that we have had as Indigenous people and as Canadians, right? So it's really important to point out, again, if we go a little bit further along in history, what I think many people go back and spark as the seed or the origination of the TRC coming together was this lawsuit that came about. So there was 27 survivors of the Indian residential school. They filed a lawsuit against the Canadian government and the United Church of Canada in around 1996. And it was from there that some of the other things that we're going to talk about came about. It's important to also point out the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. So the Aboriginal Healing Foundation was established in 1998 and ceased operations in 2014. The Aboriginal Healing Foundation was an Indigenous-led, nonprofit organization funded by the Canadian government to address the legacy of abuse in the Indian residential school system. The fund supported community-based initiatives through funding and research, focusing on healing from physical, sexual, and intergenerational trauma caused by residential schools. It provided resources including counseling, skills training, and cultural programming, and published extensive research on healing practices. So the fund their primary goal was to encourage and support Aboriginal people in developing sustainable healing processes to help address the legacy of residential schools. So the foundation was specifically tasked with addressing the physical and sexual abuse experienced in residential school system and its ongoing intergenerational impacts. And then it was also community-led, which was really important. So it emphasized community-directed healing initiatives. So some of the things that they did was provided funding for research and supported various community-designed and delivered healing initiatives. They helped with research and publication. So they conducted and funded research, compiling a significant research library to inform effective healing programs and publishing its findings and insights. They looked at diverse healing initiatives, so funding supported programs such as counseling skills, workshops, prevention of violence, addiction treatment, training of healers, and other healing activities. Yeah. So the next one is the Office of Indian Residential Schools Resolution Canada. So that it came together to manage and resolve the large number of abuse claims filed by former students against the federal government. Next slide. I'm pressing too many buttons on my screen here. Sorry, guys. All right. So when I look at the things that came before the TRC report, this is one of the crucial ones. So when we're talking about the lawsuits that are filed by former residential school survivors, it's important to understand some of the things that came out of the court case. So when that class action suit came forward, this is one of the things that developed out of it. So the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, also referred to as the IRSSA, happened in 2006. So through it, this was the residential school survivors who took the Canadian government and the churches to task, and brought their cases forward in that class action lawsuit. And these are the things that were agreed upon as a result. So they had the common experience payment. So this payment is available to all former students who attended recognized Indian residential schools. Survivors are eligible for a one-time payment of $10,000 plus an additional $3,000 for each year they attended a residential school. This is a little bit problematic sometimes for people because there are people that are struggling to find their records to show that they were in attendance, and then also to be able to show how long they were there, and then also to talk about some of the experiences that they had that also increased the funding that they received, or their payment that they received from the Canadian government as compensation. So the independent assessment process, this process allowed survivors to seek compensation for serious abuse suffered at residential schools. So it provides a claim-centered, non-adversarial approach to resolving claims of sexual and serious physical abuse. This, like I said, is a little bit problematic because there are people who didn't want to come forward to talk about their experience, but suffered great abuse while they were there. And in order for them to receive any kind of compensation, they had to speak about their experience there and speak to the things that they endured while they were there. So you can understand how it could be problematic if a survivor was asked to come forward and talk about the length of time that they were there, what kind of abuse happened, the severity of the abuse, the frequency of the abuse, in order to have some kind of compensation to happen to. And there was many people who actually talked about, they denied the occurrence of these things. I actually know an elder here. I don't want to point out any identifying information, but this elder had said that they had gone to residential school, spoke to the abuse that they endured, took that specific church who ran the residential school to court, and they filed a suit saying that it was defamation because they thought that that person was lying. And there are many, many stories like that people say, how hard they had to put efforts forward to be able to speak their truth about what actually happened, and then to have some kind of recognition or compensation for it. So you can see how that could be really problematic. So commemoration and healing initiatives, that was one of the other agreements. So the agreement included funding for various initiatives aimed at healing and commemorating the experiences of survivors in the communities. Advocacy and Public Information Program, the APIP. So this program was designed to ensure that former students and their families were informed about the benefits available under the settlement agreement. And then the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This is where it sprouted out from, right? So this was established as part of the agreement. The TRC aimed to document the experiences of survivors and promote public awareness of the legacy of residential schools. It operated from 2009 to 2015 and gathered testimonies from over 7,000 individuals. I remember reading a story somewhere where they were talking about there was many more survivors that came forward, but they said they just did not they did not want to continue to hear, like didn't have the capacity to continue to hear stories that were coming forward because of how horrific they were. And I remember also reading too that they had a different commissioner at the beginning of when they brought the Truth and Reconciliation Commission together. And that person, it's escaping my mind their name, but they said that they felt that it was a really problematic experience, that they weren't holding space for the survivors in a good way, that many of them were being re-traumatized, and they were trying to call for different actions to be taken towards this process, but were forced to fall within the confines of how the commission came together. And then so that first commissioner ended up leaving, and then the Honorable Murray Sinclair stepped in and as the commissioner for the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But can you imagine that you're one of the commissioners and you're going across Canada? And I remember them setting up, they had put a call out in the newspaper, if you had gone to residential school and you want to share your story and we want to sit with you. And so they came community, to ask people to come forward to share their stories. And yeah, I remember reading that they were like, oh, this was traumatic, so traumatic to be able to listen and to bear witness to all these stories, that they said, that's enough. We can't continue to listen to more. And then they're meant to keep it as a living record, right? So that people can go back, because this is the truth that happened as part of our Canadian history. We got next slide, please, Julian. So we're just about done here. I just wanted to point out, so the TRC report and 94 calls to action, it's a set of actionable recommendations for government, institutions, and individuals to address the legacy of residential school. There's other documentation that was also written through the development of this. One, there's summary reports. They have the final report. They have principles for reconciliation, and then they have the 94 calls to action. So if you are interested, you can go and search out the other documentation or other reports that they wrote leading up to those 94 calls to action. That is the conclusion of the learning. Oh, actually, I wanted to share one last thing. I just looked down on my piece of paper. It's really quick, and then we can go to questions and answers. One of the things that I wanted to point out too was that we did have a formal apology from the Prime Minister. So June 11th, 2008, then Prime Minister Stephen Harper, he offered a full apology on behalf of Canadians for the Indian residential school system. He stood up in the House of Commons and delivered this apology, and there were Indigenous leaders and survivors who stood witness to the speech. I actually, I'm going to turn my camera back on, if that's okay, Julia. I remember in 2008, this being televised. They had it at the college. Here where I live, they said, if you want to come and listen to the apology, we'll hold space for you. They opened up, they had an area there, and they had chairs and tables, and they had people who were there with them, and they said, well, let's watch this together. And I remember lots of different spaces that they said that they would gather people together. And I remember watching it and having so many different emotions that came up from it. I remember feeling so sad for the people who did go to residential school who would impacted directly. I remember feeling angry. And I also remember feeling, is this too little, too late? What is it, a false front? Is it, what is this that's actually happening? And is the apology going to be where it ends, right? Is them saying, hey, we've done what we needed to, we've apologized, and let's move on, together, ignoring the legacy and the impacts that residential schools have had, not only on the survivors, but their children, their grandchildren, great grandchildren, because yeah, the abuse and loss is suffered through all of those generations, right? Yeah, so now that concludes the learning part of it. So if we want to, I want to say hello for everyone who came out to listen to that timeline on some of the things that happened and occurred prior to the commission coming together. And we'll be back again